Hello, everybody. Welcome to the View from Here podcast with me, Rio Helmi. And today we have a very special guest, Michael Vatikiotis, who is a senior advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a Swiss-based private foundation. Michael has been working on promoting dialogue and conflict resolution in various places for a number of years now, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Michael also has a very extensive history of working as a journalist, formerly a BBC correspondent and editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review. For those of you who can remember that, that was quite a while back. And Michael has been a writer, broadcaster for almost 40 years. And Michael has written three books on the politics of Southeast Asia, including Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia, which was published in 2017. Michael, also very relevant to what we're going to talk about today, has family origins in the Middle East. He's lived in Egypt, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, as well as Hong Kong. His latest book, Lies Between the Lines, A Journey into the Search for the Lost Levant, published in 2022, explores the origins of his family in the Middle East. And that is so relevant to what we're going to talk about today. Michael, all of this is actually super relevant. Um, one, we've been looking at this really quite fast-moving and very fluid situation in the Middle East, which is now affecting everybody in the world. And I would just like to start off with, from your perspective as a person who's been involved in conflict resolution and dialogue and so forth, um, what on earth is happening in these dialogues? I mean, it's such a mess, and every time they start a dialogue, and suddenly in the middle of the dialogue or shortly after they supposedly break down, there's another threat. There's another military threat. What are the key mistakes that are being made in this situation, in these discussions or in these talks or whatever you want to call them?
Well, it's a very good question because I think what it indicates is a complete lack of trust in sort of diplomatic dealings, which is something that didn't happen overnight. I think it's definitely been a process in the last few years of countries, larger states, moving away from the multilateral constraints and restraints that have been put in place by the post-World War II rules-based order, anchored at the United Nations, and increasingly pursue their own interests. And that can go for larger powers like the US and China, but also for emerging middle powers. And I think that the very fact that countries feel less constrained or restrained by the international system has only brought out a naked pursuit of interests, which then leads to diplomatic dealing that is essentially not governed by any form of moderation, seeks deals based on transactional. I mean, to some extent, diplomacy is transactional, but the way that it's been conducted more recently, especially by people in the Trump administration who don't seem to want to or be willing to resort to technical or area speciality advice, which means that the negotiations themselves are not essentially driven by any particular knowledge and very quickly break down. And that has led to a deep, deep deficit in trust across the board in any form of diplomacy.
And and also wherever they happen to be, it does seem to be the same pattern. The ridiculous Venezuela thing, all that stuff. It's basically bullying. It seems to be like that's the order of the day. And I don't know whether it's a generational thing, but for me, it's particularly shocking to see these kind of negotiations, which really involve they don't just involve money or resources. It's just like I can do whatever the hell I want.
Well, as I said, I mean, it's very much reinforced by the current administration in Washington, which, in its stated national security strategy last year, essentially revealed that it would look after affairs closer to the homeland, hence the attack on Venezuela, hence the claims on Greenland. Um, and I think that, when it comes to the Iran war, one has to look at essentially the umbilical cord between Israel and the United States in terms of defense ties to explain that a little bit more than, if you like, homeland national security. It's true, however, that the United States in particular has had a very long traumatic relationship with Iran going back to the hostage taking at the US Embassy in
Mhm.
1979. And so it's a fairly easy target for any US president to hit at because it resonates strongly within the United States. You hear this 47 years of attacking the United States and declaring hatred for the United States. I mean, that's more than just a little bit of rhetoric. There is a very deep divide between Iran and the United States. But I think the main reason for the lack of trust in the negotiations was the deployment of essentially real estate developers rather than people with knowledge of the issues. And as we saw, a remarkable demonstration of transparency by the mediator, the then mediator of those negotiations before the war began, the Omani foreign minister, who essentially came to Washington to declare that progress had been made, despite
Mm.
what the envoys to Trump had reported back. So again, deep, deep mistrust, which means it's going to be very difficult to believe in the power of negotiation to end this conflict.
I think that's the scariest takeaway from all of this. I mean, especially for somebody like you who works in this and sees the value of bringing, people from opposing camps to find common talking points. I mean, that whole schematic of resolving situations seems to be, completely. Uh, it's almost antiquated now. I mean, I find that very, very disturbing. And I
It's not
don't
just
know.
it's not just a lack of trust. There's also a lack of basic information. I mean, if you're going to successfully mediate any conflict, you need to have an understanding of the dynamics of that conflict to a fairly detailed degree
Mm,
in order to understand the
yes.
position of the actors, the parties to the conflict, in order to be able to work out negotiating positions. That's very difficult in an information vacuum. And I think for several reasons today, not just in the case of the Iran war, but across the spectrum, there is less and less media coverage of conflict.
Mhm.
There is less access for journalists to the field of conflict. Very little corroboration of sort of public government positions. Um, Almost no um, actual combat reporting. Um, and, in fact, on the US side, we've seen efforts to keep the media away from covering the war and from covering the Pentagon. So I think this information vacuum plus the elevated use of artificial intelligence, manipulation and
Yes.
fakery essentially means that we have very little to go on in terms of what's actually happening.
Mm. But okay, that's for sure. And what two other things that I would add to that is you know a complete lack of moral compass is one thing that really strikes me, and the other thing is which is something which I want to touch upon later on when we start talking about Southeast Asia, but the lack not only of knowledge of the current situation, but also there seems to be a real void of understanding of the history of these places, like going back to the 20th century, because that's essential to what's going on now. And people, you rarely hear anybody talking about America's role in Iran, pre-Shah and how that all played out, which, I think has left a deep scar in the Iranian national sense of identity. And ironically, when they talk about, okay, we have to change the regime or change the, of course, well, there are failings in this current regime which nobody's really happy about. But all this has done seems to have been brought people back behind behind the regime in a sense. People are in a sense of nationalism. I don't think that's very deep-seated, but there is this thing like, wait a minute, this is our country. You can't just come and destroy destroy the last shred of civilization here.
I don't think we know very much about what's going on in Iran. That's the problem. There's been an internet blackout for 45 days. Again,
Yes.
lack of information, pure lack of information.
Yeah. Well, and now, coming to something which is, of course, relevant to your own personal, your own personal history, this history of your family in Levant and stuff. When you were working on that book, which was what you published in 2022, but you worked on it, I remember, at least a couple of years. You going backwards and forwards, if not more. Did you even imagine that this kind of situation would escalate to such a situation like this?
I'm afraid, yes. You know, uh, the Middle East, as we define it, the
Mm,
Levant more sort of specifically, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and to some extent Iraq, um, essentially have been in perpetual conflict, since the end of the Second World War and the post-colonial era. Um, one conflict of one form or another, led, of
mm,
course, by the Israel-Palestine conflict, which erupted in 1948 um, after the partition of Palestine, was given, I think, much more international, and I think, very significantly, much more international prominence after the 1967 and 73 wars
war, yeah.
between the Arab states and Israel. Um, and a very brief respite in the 1990s with the Oslo process, um, the Arab peace plan, and a series of more liberal, or one or two more liberal Israeli politicians. But then after 1994, um, and with the assassination of then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, essentially we've settled into this long series of governments that pull to the right and in Israel and have essentially been hijacked by a sort of messianic right-wing fringe that literally believes that everything that is said in the Bible is happening again today and will determine tomorrow. Um, and so therefore, Israel has become a much more unstable and irrational actor in the world today. Um, Multiple invasions of Lebanon, invasions of parts of Syria, and of course now two in the space of 8 months, two wars against Iran. I think that's the main source of instability. I mean, one can go off and talk about the the other the Arab states, Syria, of course, a regime change after almost 20 years of civil war. Egypt perpetually unstable, perpetually broke. Um, Under strongman army rule, Iraq with a federal system that's not quite working, um, Lebanon with a very weak government. So, there is weakness and fragility all around. Um, the one thing that had not been affected and had, in fact, essentially started to create, I think, two different Middle Easts was the tremendous growth of the Gulf state economies, led by UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, um, and um, and Oman to some extent, and Kuwait. And so, these states had started to pull away from the rest of the Middle East in terms of economic prosperity and looking further to the east, perhaps, as well as across the Red Sea to the African continent. And you could almost start to describe them as sort of emerging middle powers. Um, Now, that difference has, of course, shrunk tremendously since the start of the Iran war
Yes.
at the
Yes.
at the end of February, and these Gulf state economies are now just as vulnerable, if not more so, than their Levant neighbors.
What do you think there must be a really deep sense of regret amongst those states, for their let me think of a polite way of putting it, for their rapprochement or their opening, their doors to the American, American powers that be, whether that was pre-Trump or not. That made them a target for Iran, and
Well, I
so
mean, the same could be said, actually, going back in history to Southeast Asia, where, of course, after the um, Vietnam War created the same kind of effect, where countries like Thailand, Indonesia, in the 60s, their leaders were sort of felt they had to join the anti-communist crusade and got closer to the Americans, Philippines included. And of course, that led eventually to a backlash in the 1990s, against the presence of US bases in the Philippines. Thailand sort of started to become a little bit more independent of US influence. And I think we'll see the same thing happen in the Gulf, frankly. I think the lack of trust in the
Well,
US, which had bases in Kuwait, Bahrain, UAE, and Qatar, has brought upon those countries attacks from Iran when they're not actually a party to the conflict, despite what the Americans say. And so I think we'll see a similar backlash and an attempt to achieve more strategic autonomy, perhaps with the help of Turkey and Pakistan, not to mention China.
like we talked about when we talked before about your experiences in the Levant. I mean, you made you talked a lot about the what used to be there, the multicultural aspect, the multi-religious aspect, multiple languages, religions, and identities, which were coexisting, in a sort of a fluid way. And I think to some extent, pointed out that that was, really on the wane now. And now I think what now happens with all these uh, Jews, Armenians, and so forth who are still in that region. For example, I've heard, and I have no way of verifying this, but I see posts or articles about Jews in Iran, and I don't know if that's just some kind of propaganda or whatever, but you know or artificially generated, rubbish. But there is some claim that Jews in Iran actually live relatively undisturbed, and I can't imagine that. But what do you know about that?
Well, no, I mean, it's across the region, there are multiple confessional communities, Syria being the best example, Lebanon being another one. Um, the Gulf is populated by, 70% of the population is from outside, including
Hmm.
Iranians. No, I mean, that's never been the tolerance of confessional communities has never been the issue. The
I
issue
see.
is the
Yeah.
weaponization of
Hmm.
identity, particularly by Israel. Fair enough that in the 1960s and 70s, the Arab states tried to weaponize Arab identity, with
Hmm.
the Syrian Arab Republic, with Egypt, which led to, a great deal of conflict in the 1970s. Um, Now Israel is, trying to do the same thing, a greater Israel. It used to be that Nasser had the vision, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt had the vision of a greater Arab state. Now it's a greater Israeli state. Um, these movements, will ebb and flow. However, it's very difficult to see the Levant um, capitalizing on what had recently been the emergence of a more or less stable period of post-conflict recovery, particularly in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Um, if Israel is now going to become very much more aggressive towards these countries, and perhaps including Turkey.
Well, there are multiple motivations, I suppose, for Netanyahu, not least his temporarily suspended court case. But you talked about the U.S. umbilical cord to Israel, or the Israel's umbilical cord to the U.S. I heard something today which kind of I don't know why it shocked me, but it seems so strange that Netanyahu claimed that he heard about the failure of the talks in Pakistan directly from Vance when Vance was on the plane going back to the States. They reported to him, and then there was a statement that he gets daily updates from U.S. security people, daily updates on what they're planning, what they're doing, and I find that wow, that's really quite blatant, but it must be true, I guess. I don't know. I mean, there's that is something which really gives pause because the way that they reinterpreted the so-called ceasefire and said no, Lebanon was never on the thing and so forth. it's very hard to think that there has not been some, conniving behind that, the U.S. somehow were quite happy to let that happen. But, on the surface, of course, they said, oh, this is, whatever. But, you know, what does that do to the prospects of there ever being any chance of any real peace negotiations between, the U.S. and Iran? I mean, basically, I feel that Trump has put himself in a corner. He's kind of stuck, and he doesn't have anybody around him who can help him find an off ramp, which will, or they don't have the guts to tell him. He's going to have to, swallow something, some bit of his pride. But there goes Israel, and they keep going, and somehow that, they're trying to make Iran more belligerent. Is that a correct analysis of the situation, or am I just, completely missing the point there?
Well, I mean, there's a long history since the foundation of the State of Israel in the 1940s, late 1940s, of Israel wanting to influence, particularly the government of the United States. You have to remember that back in time, the United States was a reluctant supporter of the State of Israel initially.
Mhm.
It was, the drive towards the formation of Israel was led by the UK, um, and
Yes.
the US reluctantly went along because the US at the time sort of felt that the Arabs had to be consulted, which they weren't. So I think Israel's lesson from that is that they had to pay much closer attention to maintaining influence in the United States, which started with um, before she was prime minister, Golda Meir setting up the sort of the foundations of the Israel lobby in the United States, and that's of course been a fact since then, um, helping to run and fund campaigns for congressmen, influencing through well-known lobbying tactics, which other countries do as well, but just not
Hmm.
quite as perhaps focused as Israel, or consistent. So that's not new. What was new a little bit was that people felt that, Donald Trump was not as susceptible to that kind of pressure as, say, the previous administration was. Um, and, also he had declared that, as part of his campaign um, manifesto, that he was against, prolonged forever wars, and he was very critical of the wars that had been conducted in the Middle East. And indeed, this time last year, declared in Saudi Arabia that the whole sort of democracy um, foundation project that the architects of the Gulf War had for remaking the Middle East states in the image of the United States was nonsense. Um, so, this came as a bit of a surprise to everyone that Trump was so willing to go along with what Marco Rubio described as an initial decision by Israel to attack, which the US had to follow. Um, I think the public sentiment in the US indicates that for Israel, the writing is on the wall. A fairly substantial percentage of people are no longer in favor of the US government blindly doing what Israel wants it to do. And this is especially true for younger voters, who, of course, will soon be the majority. Um, and, I think the situation in Gaza has fueled that, the human rights abuses and the
Yes,
blatant naked use of violence against the Palestinian people, has shocked particularly a younger generation of American. Um, and I think that's going to have its own dynamic going for
younger Jewish Americans too.
Jewish Americans, yes.
A lot of younger
So
Jewish
so let's
Americans,
see. I
yes.
mean, I just don't think we know enough, as I said, to really understand what's really going on behind the scenes. Um,
Mm,
Both Trump and Netanyahu are very good at making public statements that they control. Um,
yes.
there's no way of corroborating what they say. Um, as I said, there's no independent media coverage of this war, frankly, anywhere. There's strict censorship in Israel, strict blackout in Iran, and there's strict censorship in the United States as well.
I mean, Netanyahu is of course, he's quite consistent, whereas when Trump is really quite, it depends on what time of day it is, what his stance is. But do you see any consistency in what he's doing at all? Is there a line there? Is there a thread that goes through this thing?
No,
Because
no, not really.
he's jumping around like and Jared Kushner, Whitcroft, Pete Hegseth. I mean, it's all so kind of it's vulgar, actually. It's really, these people are just they're clowns, and they're playing these games which are affecting millions of lives. And now, of course, it's beginning to affect. It'll affect Southeast Asia. It'll affect East Asia. It'll affect, it's affecting India and Iran, India and Pakistan already. This whole blockade idea. What do you make of that? I mean, what's going to happen, for example, if China decides, well, we don't really care about your blockade, and we're going to send Navy I mean, I don't know if that's even a possibility, our Navy to take a convoy of tankers into past the Hormuz Straits. I have no idea if that's possible, but this blockade, it seems, I mean, a blockade is an act of war, right?
Well, again, we really don't know. Um, Even as the talks were underway in Pakistan, there were reports of US destroyer approaching the Straits and turning back voluntarily after the Iranians said they would shoot at it because, of course, it was in the middle of a negotiation. I mean, who knows
Yeah.
whether this can be enforced or not? I mean, one thing is clear that, the Straits continues to be um, a challenge for global shipping, one way or another, and which has, sent oil prices over $100 a barrel. The price of jet fuel has doubled. This is going to have a severe impact everywhere. And even when the war ends, it's going to take a significant amount of time to get back to normal levels of supply because of some of the destruction of the infrastructure in the Gulf,
Mm.
not to mention Iran. So, I think the blockade, it's very hard to interpret. Um,
Mm.
and we have to see on a day-to-day basis what is evolving on the ground. The fear everyone has, of course, is that Israel is just waiting to get back to a full-blown attack on Iran again, which the US may be forced to go along with, which would be a disaster for everyone. Um, and one starts to have to look at ways in which in the US there may be attempts to block this, by fair means or foul. I mean, obviously there's no real congressional oversight, but there's obviously quite a bit of unrest and concern in the US military about the way this is going, not to mention increasing mounting reports of concern about the president's health. So there are a number of scenarios which could play out on the US side to determine the course of this. Um, the bottom line, though, is can the US basically tell Israel enough, and we're going to stop the arms?
That's the crucial thing. That's the
Yeah.
crux. But so we have this. When everybody talks about oil and how difficult it is to the price of oil, et cetera. But there's a whole other aspect of this oil thing. Of course, there's all the chemicals and the fertilizers, and countries like China, you know, heavily dependent on fertilizers and so forth that are imported. Uh, it goes all the way down to the farmer, basically. It's not just somebody who has a big fuel consuming, car or, when you're looking at, you're very familiar with the situation in Southeast Asia. What what struck me when the Indonesian Minister for Energy and Resources, Balil, he came out with a statement a couple of weeks ago. He says, "Oh, don't worry about the price of fuel in Indonesia; it'll stay the same. We have secured enough resources and enough, stuff that will be fine." And somebody said, "Well, where are you getting it?" And he refused to answer, which is like a weird way of, addressing the press. You say somebody says, "Well, where are these stockpiles coming from?" He says, "Well, don't worry about that." It's like, and at this level of, I don't know whether that's incompetence or just, what is it? But this denial of the situation, the potential situation, that could just go very awry in Indonesia because we're trying to step up our development, but we're having all these issues, and all of a sudden, price of fuel might go up. And from what I hear from people in the oil industry, it's very likely that if nothing changes by the end of the month, we'll have to put oil prices up, and all those subsidies will have to be, revisited. What
No, I
happens
mean
on the
the
ground?
Indonesian budget is is calculated on a price of, I believe, $70 per barrel. And the price of oil is now over 100. So we're already in that territory in terms of subsidies. Um, I think in Southeast Asia as a whole, I mean, there are um, many, many ways in which they can, over time, um, compensate. I think Russia will become a major supplier of oil to everyone, and it's already started to happen. Oil and gas. I think that the use of biofuel will increase. I mean, I think there will be a move now to look at more renewable energy going forward, which the Chinese are leaders in. Um,
But that takes time.
it takes time. I think the Russians are going to fill the gap to begin with. Um, I think that there's going to be some oil that gets out of Saudi Arabia via the Trans-Hejaz pipeline, as long as the Houthis don't close the Red Sea. I think I wouldn't say that it's overblown, but I think people will adjust. There will be higher prices all around. Southeast Asian economies, by the latest reading, will lose 1% of GDP in the coming year because of this.
Is that
Um,
all? Really?
and
Hmm.
according to the ADB. And I think that important sectors like tourism will be hit, which is a great income generator in countries like Thailand, Cambodia, also perhaps Indonesia.
It's already being hit. We
It's
already
it's
have
it's
less.
already hit, yes. And so, I mean, people have tried to compare it a little bit with the COVID slowdown, but in many ways it's far deeper. If inputs like fertilizer become scarce, cooking gas in India, it's very difficult for people to actually fuel the economy. Whereas during COVID, it wasn't so much the inputs, it was just the activity that was constrained and the market demand.
Mhm.
Now it's very much the inputs. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think that we're strapping ourselves in for a very difficult time.
I mean, I think even beyond that, I think India has a huge generic medicine industry, which is dependent on many chemicals, which, and that's even scarier because we're talking directly about healthcare, but you have, what is it, how many billion people who are dependent, not only in India, but of course, India exports a lot of their generic medicine as well. That's another aspect which, it doesn't seem to get talked about a lot.
Yeah, it's going to take a year or so. I mean, if the war does end towards the end of April, which is not a done deal, it's going to take a year, I think, for economies to recover, because there'll be the Gulf states have already declared force majeure on some of their supplies. It's just not going to take a short time to recover. Five years actually for some of the facilities. Um, so yeah, it's bad, and for no particularly good reason. Um, and we hear reports that you know there will be alternative supply chains, alternative trade corridors that will be set up to get around the Strait of Hormuz, to get around the maritime routes. But there's no doubt that the maritime routes are the most profitable, and people will have to come back to use them.
Yeah, well, I mean, we import a lot of oil from Nigeria, for example, and that's definitely already something to. But how do you if you how would you assess the readiness and the actual implementation of measures in Indonesia, particularly, and also in the rest of Southeast Asia, are they really gearing up to deal with this, or is it just kind of like let's wait and see, wait and see? What's your assessment of how ready these governments are to deal with
Well, there's a
these?
long history in Southeast Asia of technocratic economic capacity to sort of deal with crisis. It takes a bit of time, but as we saw during COVID, the measures generally worked quite well. Subsidies came into effect. Many of these countries don't have huge debt overhangs, although Indonesia has a worrying one. Um, so I think it just depends on the quality of the officials. We've had 30 or 40 years of fairly good economic management in the region, um, and a more stable political system, even if we don't always like, the way it's going. The fact is, it is relatively stable. Society has grown to be much less reliant on primary resources. There's less agriculture, which of course means there's more of an urban economy, which means that actually if there are shortages, it does begin to affect them. They can't sort of live off the land. Um, so yeah, it's sort of pluses and minuses, but generally with I think the political stability, the generally sort of reasonably sensible economic management across the region. Plus, one shouldn't forget that while the region is suffering a sort of shortage of primary resources, there's a lot of cash flowing into the region now away from the Gulf. Singapore's now had, I think, the highest number of bank receipts in its history almost. Um, coming into Singapore to take advantage of its private banking. We're seeing a lot of capital come back to the region, and I think this will have a counterbalancing effect to some extent.
Okay. So you're almost optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, we've been through a number of crises, 97, 2008, 9, um, COVID, nothing collapsed.
Hmm. Well, that's good to hear. I mean, from a person who has had so much experience in this, but and politically, how do you see that any of this will affect the political landscape in countries like Indonesia?
I don't think there's much impact. I mean, this is far away. It's different from 2001. There isn't a big Shia community in Southeast Asia. Um, there, there's no real love lost for Israel. In
Well,
fact,
but Prabowo joined the Board of Peace, which is sponsored by.
Prabowo's inclination seems to be to try and get close to as many big powers as he can, which includes Russia, the US, China. And so on all three fronts, he's demonstrated a degree of tolerance. Joining the Board of Peace, he was in Moscow this week to speak with Putin as his defense minister was in Washington. No coincidence, I think. And they've in his first year he signed this document with China on joint development in the Natunas. So, I mean, he seems to be inclined to work with the bigger powers and to show or to demonstrate that he's somehow balancing between them, which is not always easy to do. Um, so who knows? But I think that um, generally Southeast Asia tries to go for the balance, tries not to sort of land in one camp or the other. I think it's managed to escape the blowback from this war in ideological terms, unlike 2001, where it sort of became a main focus of conflict. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic, but I think that because the world is going to suffer from this
Yes,
heavily, it'll affect
all of us.
financing, it'll affect the economies and growth. But in terms of stability, I'm fairly optimistic.
And what about the situation? What do you think China has, how have they repositioned themselves, due to this whole thing? I mean, the whole Taiwan issue and so forth. Do you think that the military options there are still something that is to be concerned about, or are they going to go to a different route? I mean, this is certainly the world has changed, radically since Donald Trump took office. I mean, the whole geopolitical you know, layout has really changed and is continuing to change. What would you not predict, but what do you feel about what might happen there between, first of all, China's role in Asia as a whole and also towards Taiwan? I mean, that's a big kind of, they're sitting
Well,
there.
a friend of mine wrote an article the other day, which I quite agree with, which is that when people look at China, particularly from the United States, they tend to look at China through the lens of the US's own behavior as a great power, which is not a very good
Hmm.
guide for China.
Hmm.
China is a rather insular place um, with a society that is not as pluralistic as the United States, um, with a long history of not really projecting adventure power in an adventurist way, which in the United States goes back to the late 19th century in the Philippines. Um, and China is very cautious and risk averse and, doesn't want to lose face in the slightest way internationally, which I think has bred a great deal of caution in their approach to what many people see as a tremendous opportunity for China to grow its power and influence at the expense of the United States. I think they're reluctant to do that so openly. Um, I think China has its own internal economic challenges as well and demographic challenges, not to mention, the leadership issues which have to be resolved by 2027. So I think despite everything, you see a very cautious, slow-moving China, um, concerned about its own security above all else. Um, but yes, exploring what it can do where, in a sort of relatively risk-free way. Um, in 2023, they did bring about this rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they are a guarantor of that agreement. They have played some role behind the scenes in the current diplomacy to end the war, along with Russia. Um, and the UN has, China has been careful to highlight the primacy of the UN and the multilateral institutions. It wants to be seen as a sort of a good global citizen, in contrast perhaps to the US. But that's as far as we can take it for now. It's very hard to predict where this is going to go.
Mhm. Any last thoughts, Michael, before we wrap it up?
Well,
About
it's not yet World War III, but I think there's a great deal of concern that if the next stage of this conflict is escalation, everyone will slowly but surely be dragged into it one way or another, and that's a very bad outlook for the world. As I said, going back to the beginning, the problem in many ways is the zero trust in current forms of diplomacy, which therefore makes it more likely that escalation and the hubris of power is going to predominate.
how can we rebuild that trust? What's the key? What are the key elements? Is it one particular nation, for example, the United States, that if they could, change their regime, or is there some other avenues? I mean, you're the person who is very familiar with conflict resolution. What would you see as the key to it? I mean, if
Well,
it's
we're already
possible.
seeing a new pattern emerge with the role of middle powers like Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia.
Hmm.
And I think that's a good thing. It shows that middle powers can be
Yes.
responsible, that they have some agency, especially if they work in concert. Um, and so, noticeable with this mediation by Pakistan is that Europe's not involved, the UN is not involved. This is a middle power dominated, emerging middle power dominated concert of states that are trying to mediate the end of a conflict. And if they succeed, it's going to change the landscape of peacemaking considerably.
And being neighbors of Iran, there's a lot of validity to their role in that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, Michael, closing statement or
No, I'm fine. Good.
good. Thank you so much, Michael. That was great, and have a nice day in
Thank
Singapore.
you. Thank you, Rio.
We
Nice to talk
will.
to you, as always.
Good to see you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.